At 6 feet 9 inches and nearly 300 pounds, Edmund Kemper possessed both the physical presence of a giant and the intellectual capacity of a genius. Tonight, we begin our most psychologically complex journey yet into the mind of a killer who understood his own pathology better than most trained professionals. Over the next 2 hours, we'll explore how exceptional intelligence can become weaponized by profound psychological damage, creating one of history's most articulate and terrifying serial killers.
Hey, while the first details load up, let me quickly ask you something. If you've ever listened to a deep true crime story like this to help you think, sleep, or just understand what makes people tick, then you're in the right place. A quick pause before we dive deeper. If this kind of story keeps you company in the late hours, consider tapping like or subscribe. It truly helps this small channel reach more curious minds. And I'd love to know, where are you listening from tonight? What time is it where you are? It's always comforting to know we're not alone in the dark.
Tonight's analysis will take us through Edmund Kemper's transformation from abused child to calculating killer, examining how his genius-level intellect became the perfect tool for understanding and manipulating human psychology. We'll explore the complex relationship between intelligence and evil, providing insights that help us understand not just what Edmund became, but how such profound psychological damage develops and why it's so difficult to detect. Edmund Emil Kemper III was born December 18, 1948, in Burbank, California, into a family structure that would prove psychologically catastrophic. His father, Edmund J.R.B., was an electrician whose work often took him away from home, leaving young Edmund primarily under the influence of his domineering mother, Clarnell. Clarnell Kemper emerges as perhaps the most psychologically destructive maternal figure in criminal psychology. Standing nearly 6 feet tall herself, she possessed a volatile temperament that manifested in verbal abuse, emotional manipulation, and systematic psychological destruction of her son's developing sense of self. From his earliest memories, Edmund experienced his mother's pathological need to control and humiliate. She would berate him for his size, his awkwardness, his very existence. The psychological foundation being laid here is critical: a child's sense of worth being systematically destroyed by the person who should provide unconditional love. The family's frequent relocations added another layer of instability. By age 8, Edmund had lived in multiple states, never developing stable peer relationships or consistent external validation. This nomadic lifestyle prevented him from forming the social connections that might have counterbalanced his toxic home environment. Edmund's intellectual gifts became apparent early. His IQ would later test at 1 for 5, placing him in the genius range. However, this intelligence developed in isolation, becoming a tool for internal analysis rather than social connection. He began to understand his own psychological processes in ways that would prove both fascinating and terrifying. The absence of his father created a void that his mother filled with psychological poison. Edmund Seoster's work-related absences meant the boy had no male role model, no buffer against maternal abuse, no alternative perspective on relationships or emotional regulation. Clarnell's treatment of Edmund reveals classic patterns of narcissistic abuse. She alternated between neglect and overwhelming attention, praise and devastating criticism, creating the psychological instability that breeds either extreme submission or explosive rebellion. Edmund's size and intelligence made submission impossible. By age 10, Edmund was displaying concerning behavioral patterns. He began torturing and killing family pets, starting with his sister's cat. This wasn't simple childhood cruelty, it was systematic exploration of power, control, and the mechanisms of death. The psychological significance of animal cruelty in Edmund's development cannot be overstated. These acts represented his first attempts to exert absolute control over living beings, to experience the power that was systematically denied to him in his relationship with his mother. Edmund's early sexual fantasies began incorporating themes of violence and death. He would later describe elaborate scenarios involving killing and having sexual relations with female victims. The fusion of sexuality and violence was occurring at a critical developmental stage. His relationship with his younger sisters, particularly Ellen, became increasingly complex. Edmund both protected them from their mother's abuse while simultaneously resenting them for receiving better treatment. This created internal conflict between protective instincts and homicidal ideation. The family's move to Montana when Edmund was 13 marked another crucial transition. Rural isolation amplified his psychological disturbance while providing fewer social outlets and supervision. The vast landscapes would later influence his body disposal methods. Edmund's academic performance remained exceptional despite his psychological turmoil. Teachers recognized his intelligence but noted his social awkwardness and underlying anger. This created a pattern of intellectual achievement masking profound emotional disturbance. His mother's decision to send him to live with his paternal grandparents represented her acknowledgement that she could no longer control him. However, this wasn't motivated by concern for Edmund's well-being, it was self-preservation, as she recognized his growing potential for violence. The psychological damage was already profound. By adolescence, Edmund had developed a complex internal world where violence represented power, where women were both objects of desire and targets of rage, where his intellectual superiority justified his antisocial fantasies. Living with his grandparents initially provided some stability. Edmund and Maud Kemper were elderly, traditional, and initially unable to recognize the psychological time bomb living in their home. Their kindness couldn't end years of psychological abuse. Edmund's grandfather became a father figure he'd never had, teaching him about firearms and hunting. However, these skills would eventually serve his violent fantasies rather than providing healthy outlets for his aggression. The grandmother's attempts at discipline triggered Edmund's deep-seated rage toward female authority figures. Any attempt to control or correct him activated the psychological wounds inflicted by his mother's abuse. By age 15, Edmund had developed sophisticated psychological defense mechanisms. He could present as charming and intelligent while harboring increasingly violent fantasies. This dual nature would characterize his entire criminal career. His first serious violent ideation focused on killing his mother. He would spend hours planning elaborate scenarios, understanding that she represented the source of his psychological damage. However, the practical impossibility of escaping consequences from matricide redirected his fantasies towards strangers. The isolation of rural California provided Edmund with extensive time for fantasy development. Long walks in the mountains allowed him to mentally rehearse violent scenarios, to plan body disposal methods, to develop the methodology that would characterize his later crimes. His intellectual gifts allowed him to understand criminal psychology from an academic perspective. He read extensively about other killers, analyzing their methods, their mistakes, their psychological patterns. This self-education would make him one of history's most methodical killers. Edmund's sexual development occurred entirely within the context of violent fantasy. He never developed healthy relationships with peers, never learned appropriate sexual expression. His sexuality became inextricably linked with violence and death. The psychological pressure continued building throughout his early teens. His grandmother's increasing awareness of his disturbing behavior led to more restrictions, more attempts at control, more triggering of his fundamental rage toward female authority. Edmund's first murder victims would be his grandparents, the only people who had shown him genuine kindness. This paradox reveals the depth of his psychological disturbance. His capacity for violence had become so profound that even positive relationships couldn't overcome his fundamental pathology. The morning of August 27, 1964, 15-year-old Edmund was helping his grandmother with household chores when a minor disagreement escalated. His grandmother's attempt to correct his behavior triggered the accumulated rage of years of maternal abuse. Edmund shot his grandmother in the head with a .22 caliber rifle, then stabbed her repeatedly with a kitchen knife. The excessive violence reveals the intensity of his psychological release. This wasn't simply killing. It was the explosive expression of suppressed rage. When his grandfather returned home, Edmund shot him before he could discover his wife's body. This killing was practical rather than emotional. Edmund was already demonstrating the calculated thinking that would characterize his later crimes. Edmund's immediate call to his mother after the murders reveals the psychological centrality of their relationship. Even after committing double homicide, his primary concern was his mother's reaction, demonstrating how completely she dominated his psychological landscape. His confession to police was remarkably articulate for a 15-year-old. Edmund could describe his actions, his motivations, his emotional state with clinical precision. This intellectual approach to his own violence would become his signature characteristic. The psychological evaluation ordered by the court revealed Edmund's extraordinary intelligence alongside profound antisocial pathology. Psychiatrists recognized his potential for future violence while being impressed by his analytical capabilities. His commitment to Atascadero State Hospital began a new phase of psychological development. Surrounded by other violent offenders and mental health professionals, Edmund would spend his late teens and early 20s developing his understanding of criminal psychology. The institutional environment provided Edmund with structure, routine, and intellectual stimulation he'd never experienced. Paradoxically, the hospital became the most psychologically healthy environment of his life, allowing him to develop his intellectual gifts while suppressing his violent impulses. His interactions with psychiatrists and psychologists gave Edmund unprecedented insight into his own psychological processes. He learned to articulate his thoughts, to analyze his motivations, to present himself as reformed while maintaining his fundamental pathology. The other patients at Atascadero provided Edmund with a laboratory for studying criminal psychology. He observed their behaviors, their manipulation techniques, their methods of presenting themselves to authorities. This informal education supplemented his formal psychological treatment. Edmund's size and intelligence made him a dominant figure in the hospital hierarchy. Other patients feared and respected him, giving him the social status he'd never achieved in the outside world. This reinforced his association between violence and power. His relationship with hospital staff was complex. They recognized his intelligence and potential for rehabilitation while remaining aware of his capacity for violence. Edmund learned to present himself as a success story while maintaining his fundamental antisocial orientation. The psychological testing administered throughout his hospitalization revealed consistent patterns, exceptional intelligence, profound antisocial tendencies, and sophisticated manipulation abilities. His IQ consistently tested in the genius range, but his empathy scores remained virtually non-existent. Edmund's 5-year hospitalization provided him with extensive time for psychological self-analysis. He developed theories about his own pathology, his relationship with his mother, his violent fantasies. This intellectual understanding would make him one of history's most psychologically articulate killers. By age 21, Edmund had convinced his psychiatrist that he was sufficiently rehabilitated for release. His intellectual gifts, his apparent insight into his psychological problems, and his exemplary institutional behavior masked the fact that his fundamental pathology remained unchanged. The psychological foundation for his future crimes was complete. The transformation of Edmund Kemper from institutionalized patient to functioning member of society represents one of criminal psychology's most fascinating case studies. During his 5 years at Atascadero State Hospital, Edmund didn't simply serve time, he conducted an intensive graduate-level education in manipulation, criminal psychology, and most importantly, how to present himself as reformed while maintaining his fundamental pathology. Edmund's release from Atascadero in 1969, age 21, marked the beginning of his most psychologically complex phase. He had spent his late teens and early 20s in an institutional environment that provided structure, intellectual stimulation, and paradoxically, the most stable period of his life. The young man who emerged from the hospital was dramatically different from the awkward 15-year-old who had entered. Edmund had grown to his full imposing height of 6 feet 9 inches, weighing nearly 300 pounds. His physical presence now matched his intellectual dominance. More significantly, Edmund had developed sophisticated psychological defenses and manipulation techniques. His interactions with mental health professionals had taught him how to present himself as insightful, remorseful, and rehabilitated while maintaining his core antisocial pathology. His return to live with his mother in Santa Cruz represented the ultimate psychological test. Clarnell had remarried and divorced during Edmund's hospitalization, her personal life remaining as chaotic as ever. The toxic dynamic that had originally created his pathology was immediately reactivated. However, Edmund was no longer the powerless child who had been systematically abused. His size, intelligence, and institutional experience had transformed him into someone who could match his mother's psychological warfare. Their relationship became a complex dance of mutual manipulation and barely contained violence. The Santa Cruz area in 1969 provided Edmund with the perfect environment for his psychological evolution. The University of California campus created a population of young women who fit his victim profile, while the rural highways provided ideal hunting grounds and body disposal sites. Edmund's decision to pursue a career in law enforcement reveals the sophisticated nature of his psychological evolution. He understood that this profession would provide him with insider knowledge of investigative techniques, access to crime scenes, and the ultimate psychological satisfaction of fooling those whose job it was to catch him. His applications to local police departments were unsuccessful, officially due to his height exceeding department standards. However, this rejection may have saved lives by preventing him from gaining official access to weapons, authority, and investigative information. Undeterred, Edmund found alternative ways to satisfy his need for law enforcement connection. He began frequenting police bars, developing friendships with officers, and positioning himself as someone interested in criminal psychology and investigation techniques. These relationships with law enforcement personnel provided Edmund with invaluable intelligence about investigative procedures, evidence collection, and criminal profiling. He learned what mistakes to avoid, what evidence to eliminate, and how investigators thought about serial crimes. Edmund's enrollment at Santa Cruz Community College represented his attempt to create a legitimate identity while pursuing his darker interests. He studied psychology with particular focus on abnormal behavior, criminal pathology, and forensic techniques. His academic work became a laboratory for understanding his own psychology and that of other criminals. Edmund could analyze case studies of serial killers while secretly developing his own methodology, using legitimate educational resources to enhance his criminal capabilities. The psychological compartmentalization Edmund developed during this period was extraordinary. He could function as a seemingly normal student and community member while maintaining elaborate violent fantasies and criminal planning. This dual existence required sophisticated psychological management. His relationship with his mother continued to deteriorate despite his newfound psychological tools. Clarnell's continued attempts to control and belittle him triggered the same rage patterns that had led to his grandparents' murders. But now Edmund had better emotional regulation and strategic thinking. Edmund began working various jobs during this period, including construction and highway maintenance. These positions provided him with knowledge of remote areas, traffic patterns, and body disposal sites that would prove crucial to his later crimes. His sexual fantasies during this period became increasingly elaborate and specific. Edmund developed detailed scenarios involving the abduction, murder, and necrophilic violation of young women. These fantasies served as mental rehearsals for future actions. The psychological pressure of maintaining his reformed facade while harboring increasingly violent urges created significant internal tension. Edmund managed this through elaborate fantasy lives, extensive criminal research, and careful observation of potential victims. His size and apparent gentleness made Edmund particularly effective at gaining trust. Young women saw him as a harmless giant, someone who posed no threat despite his imposing physical presence. This psychological camouflage became his greatest asset. Edmund's intelligence allowed him to study victim selection with scientific precision. He observed behavioral patterns, identified vulnerability markers, and developed targeting criteria that would maximize his success while minimizing detection risk. The development of his modus operandi during this period reveals sophisticated criminal psychology. Edmund understood that consistency and method would eventually lead to his capture, so he planned variations in technique, location, and victim type to confuse investigators. His practice runs began during this period driving the highways at night, identifying potential victims, following lone hitchhikers, and testing his ability to approach targets without arousing suspicion. These rehearsals refined his techniques while satisfying his immediate urges. Edmund's relationship with weapons became more sophisticated during this evolution. He acquired various firearms legally, studied their capabilities, and practiced with them regularly. His institutional connections helped him understand which weapons would be most effective for his purposes. The psychological triggers that would eventually activate his killing phase were building throughout this period. His mother's continued abuse, his sexual frustration, his intellectual superiority complex, and his need for ultimate control were creating pressure that required violent release. Edmund's study of other serial killers during this period provided him with a roadmap of what to do and what to avoid. He analyzed their mistakes, their detection patterns, and their psychological profiles to develop his own superior methodology. His first tentative approaches to potential victims began during this phase. Edmund would offer rides to hitchhikers, engage them in conversation, and then release them unharmed. These interactions served as practice sessions for developing his victim acquisition techniques. The psychological preparation for murder involved extensive mental conditioning. Edmund had to overcome normal human inhibitions against killing, develop emotional detachment from victims, and create justification systems that would allow him to commit extreme violence. His understanding of investigative psychology grew more sophisticated through his police contacts and academic study. Edmund learned how criminal profiles were developed, what evidence was most valuable, and how investigators connected crimes to specific perpetrators. The development of his victim disposal methodology required extensive planning and practice. Edmund scouted remote locations, tested access routes, and developed systems for quickly and efficiently disposing of bodies while minimizing evidence. His psychological evolution during this period also involved developing post-crime procedures. Edmund planned how he would behave after committing murders, how he would interact with investigators, and how he would maintain his psychological equilibrium while under scrutiny. The final phase of his psychological evolution involved overcoming the psychological barrier to committing his first random murder. Edmund had killed his grandparents in emotional rage, but planned serial killing required a different psychological state entirely. Edmund's preparation included developing justification systems that would allow him to commit extreme violence without psychological breakdown. He created elaborate rationalizations about victim selection, societal benefit, and his own psychological needs. His study of criminal interrogation techniques prepared him for eventual capture. Edmund learned how to present himself during questioning, what information to reveal, and how to use his psychological knowledge to manipulate investigators. The psychological compartmentalization required to maintain his double life became increasingly sophisticated. Edmund developed separate personas for different aspects of his life: the reformed former patient, the helpful community member, and the calculating predator. His relationship with his own violence became more intellectualized during this period. Edmund could analyze his own psychological processes with clinical detachment, understanding his motivations while maintaining emotional distance from his actions. The psychological preparation was complete by early 1972. Edmund had developed the methodology, acquired the tools, identified the hunting grounds, and overcome the psychological barriers necessary to begin his serial killing career. His final preparation involved creating elaborate fantasy scenarios that served as mental rehearsals for actual crimes. These fantasies became increasingly detailed and specific, eventually requiring real-world implementation to provide adequate psychological satisfaction. The psychological evolution from institutional patient to calculating serial killer was complete. Edmund had transformed himself from an impulsive teenager who killed in rage to a sophisticated predator who could plan, execute, and conceal multiple murders while maintaining the appearance of a reformed and productive member of society. May 7, 1972 marked a watershed moment in criminal psychology, the day Edmund Kemper crossed the threshold from fantasy to reality, from potential killer to active predator. The methodical precision with which he executed his first murders reveals a level of criminal sophistication rarely seen in initial violent acts, demonstrating how his years of psychological preparation had created a fully formed killing machine. The selection of Marion Pess and Anita Lucchesa as his first victims was not random chance, but the culmination of months of careful observation and planning. These two 18-year-old Fresno State students represented the perfect convergence of Edmund's victim criteria: young, attractive, vulnerable, and accessible through the hitchhiking culture of early 1970s California. Edmund's decision to begin killing on this particular day reveals the psychological pressure that had been building within him. His elaborate fantasy life had reached a point where mental rehearsals no longer provided adequate satisfaction. The gap between imagination and reality had become psychologically unbearable. The methodical nature of his approach demonstrates the sophisticated criminal psychology he had developed. Edmund didn't simply encounter potential victims and act impulsively. He had been driving the highways for weeks, studying traffic patterns, identifying optimal locations, and perfecting his victim acquisition techniques. His choice of Highway 101 near Santa Cruz as his hunting ground was psychologically significant. This location provided easy access to the university population while offering quick escape routes to remote disposal areas. Edmund had studied this territory extensively, understanding traffic patterns and police patrol schedules. The psychological transformation required to approach his first intended victims reveals the compartmentalization skills Edmund had developed. He could present himself as a friendly, harmless giant offering assistance while maintaining complete emotional detachment from his violent intentions. His initial contact with Pes and Lucchesa demonstrates his sophisticated understanding of victim psychology. Edmund knew exactly how to present himself to gain trust. His size made him appear protective rather than threatening. His calm demeanor suggested reliability, and his offer of a ride seemed like genuine kindness. The psychological manipulation began immediately upon their entry into his vehicle. Edmund engaged them in casual conversation, asking about their studies, their destinations, their lives. This wasn't simple small talk, it was psychological profiling that would inform his subsequent actions. His decision to deviate from their intended destination without immediate explanation reveals his growing confidence in his control over the situation. Edmund had moved beyond the point of no return, transitioning from helpful stranger to predator with calculated precision. The psychological moment when his victims realize their danger represents a crucial element of Edmund's satisfaction. He had studied victim psychology extensively and understood that the transition from trust to terror provided him with the ultimate expression of power and control. His use of a firearm to control his victims demonstrates the sophisticated planning that had gone into this moment. Edmund had practiced with weapons extensively, understanding their psychological impact as tools of intimidation as well as instruments of death. The drive to his predetermined killing location reveals the methodical nature of his criminal psychology. Edmund wasn't improvising, he was executing a carefully planned operation that he had mentally rehearsed dozens of times. Every aspect had been considered and prepared for. His choice to kill Pes first while forcing Lucchesa to witness demonstrates his understanding of psychological torture. This wasn't simply about ending lives, it was about experiencing absolute power over helpless victims, about creating maximum terror and suffering. The excessive violence he employed in the murders reveals the intensity of psychological release Edmund experienced. Years of suppressed rage, sexual frustration, and power fantasies were being explosively expressed through acts of extreme brutality. His decision to engage in necrophilic acts with his victims represents the fusion of sexuality and violence that had been developing in his psychology for years. This wasn't aberrant behavior for Edmund, it was the logical culmination of his sexual development within the context of violent fantasy. The methodical dismemberment of his victims demonstrates Edmund's clinical approach to his crimes. He had studied anatomy, practiced with animals, and developed techniques for efficiently processing bodies. This was systematic rather than frenzied behavior. His psychological state during the disposal process reveals his remarkable emotional detachment. Edmund could transport body parts, select disposal sites, and eliminate evidence while maintaining the calm, analytical mindset of someone solving a complex logistical problem. The psychological satisfaction Edmund derived from successfully completing his first murders cannot be overstated. He had proven to himself that his elaborate planning was effective, that his psychological preparation was adequate, and that he could successfully execute and conceal extreme violence. His return to normal daily activities immediately after the murders demonstrates the sophisticated compartmentalization he had developed. Edmund could commit horrific acts and then seamlessly transition back to his role as a reformed former patient and productive community member. The psychological high he experienced from his successful crimes created an immediate addiction to the entire process. Edmund had discovered that reality exceeded even his most elaborate fantasies, creating an insatiable need for repetition and escalation. His interaction with law enforcement during the initial investigation reveals his sophisticated understanding of criminal psychology. Edmund could present himself as a concerned citizen while secretly enjoying his insider knowledge of the crimes being investigated. The psychological analysis of his first victims provided Edmund with valuable data for future crimes. He studied their reactions, their responses to terror, their physical characteristics, and their behavioral patterns to refine his victim selection criteria. His decision to retain personal items from his victims demonstrates the psychological importance of trophies in his criminal development. These objects served as tangible connections to his acts of ultimate power, providing ongoing psychological satisfaction between active crimes. The psychological pressure to repeat his success began building immediately after his first murders. Edmund had crossed a psychological threshold from which there was no return. He had become addicted to the ultimate expression of power and control that killing provided. His study of the police investigation into his crimes provided him with valuable intelligence about investigative techniques and evidence analysis. Edmund used this information to refine his methodology and avoid the mistakes that had led to other killers' capture. The psychological impact of successfully fooling law enforcement added another layer to Edmund's satisfaction. He wasn't simply getting away with murder, he was demonstrating his intellectual superiority over those whose job it was to catch him. His development of victim acquisition techniques became more sophisticated after his initial success. Edmund refined his approach, perfected his psychological manipulation skills, and identified the most effective methods for gaining victim trust and compliance. The psychological justification systems he employed to rationalize his crimes became more elaborate after his first murders. Edmund developed complex rationalizations about victim selection, societal benefit, and his own psychological needs that allowed him to continue killing without emotional breakdown. His understanding of criminal psychology continued to evolve based on his practical experience. Edmund could now compare academic theories about serial killing with his own lived experience, creating a unique perspective that would make him one of history's most psychologically sophisticated killers. The psychological foundation for his future crimes was now complete. Edmund had proven his methodology, satisfied his immediate needs, and established patterns that would guide his subsequent murders. The transition from potential killer to active serial predator was psychologically irreversible. His first murders represented more than just the beginning of his killing career. They marked his psychological transformation into something beyond normal human experience. Edmund had become a predator whose intelligence, planning ability, and emotional detachment made him one of the most dangerous killers in criminal history. The psychological implications of his successful first crimes would drive Edmund to continue killing until his eventual capture. He had discovered the ultimate expression of his need for power and control, creating an addiction that would claim 8 more victims before his psychological journey reached its inevitable conclusion. What distinguishes Edmund Kemper from virtually every other serial killer in criminal history is the scientific precision with which he approached murder. This wasn't the chaotic violence of a disorganized mind, but rather the methodical application of genius-level intelligence to the systematic hunting, killing, and disposal of human beings. His methodology represents perhaps the most sophisticated criminal system ever documented. Edmund's victim selection process operated with the precision of a research scientist choosing test subjects. He had developed specific criteria based on extensive observation and psychological analysis. Young women, typically college students, physically attractive, traveling alone, and most importantly, psychologically vulnerable through their trust in human kindness. The geographical component of his methodology reveals sophisticated criminal psychology. Edmund understood that successful serial killing required intimate knowledge of territory, traffic patterns, police patrol schedules, and disposal sites. He had transformed the Santa Cruz area into his personal hunting preserve. His vehicle became a mobile killing laboratory, equipped with everything necessary for victim acquisition, control, murder, and initial body processing. Edmund had modified his car to serve multiple functions: transportation, prison, execution chamber, and temporary morgue. The psychological manipulation techniques Edmund employed to gain victim trust represent a masterclass in human psychology. His understanding of how young women assess threat levels allowed him to present himself as the antithesis of danger, a gentle giant offering kindness rather than a calculating predator. His timing methodology was equally sophisticated. Edmund understood that successful victim acquisition required careful attention to environmental factors, weather conditions, traffic density, time of day, and potential witness presence. He hunted only when conditions were optimal for success and concealment. The weapon selection process reveals his analytical approach to murder. Edmund chose firearms not for their killing power alone, but for their psychological impact on victims. The threat of a gun provided him with complete control while minimizing victim resistance and maintaining the calm atmosphere he required. His killing methodology was designed to maximize psychological satisfaction while minimizing evidence creation. Edmund had studied forensic science extensively, understanding what evidence investigators sought and how to avoid leaving traces that could connect him to his crimes. The post-mortem activities Edmund engaged in reveal the depth of his psychological pathology. His necrophilic behavior wasn't simply sexual deviance, it represented his need for absolute control over his victims, extending his power beyond death itself. His dismemberment techniques demonstrate the clinical detachment he brought to every aspect of his crimes. Edmund approached body processing with the same methodical precision a surgeon might bring to an operation, viewing victims as materials to be efficiently processed rather than as human beings. The disposal methodology Edmund developed was perhaps the most sophisticated aspect of his criminal system. He had identified multiple remote locations, developed transportation techniques for body parts, and created disposal methods that would delay discovery and compromise evidence. His evidence elimination procedures reveal his extensive knowledge of forensic investigation. Edmund understood that successful concealment required not just hiding bodies, but eliminating all traces of victim contact, vehicle evidence, and circumstantial connections. The psychological compartmentalization required to maintain his methodology was extraordinary. Edmund could transition from brutal killer to normal community member with seamless efficiency, maintaining separate psychological states for different aspects of his life. His documentation system, though mental rather than written, was remarkably detailed. Edmund maintained precise records of victim characteristics, crime locations, disposal sites, and investigative responses. This internal database informed his continuous methodology refinements. The timing between his crimes reveals sophisticated psychological management. Edmund understood that too frequent killing would increase detection risk, while too infrequent activity would fail to satisfy his psychological needs. He developed optimal intervals that balanced risk and satisfaction. His interaction methodology with law enforcement during investigations demonstrates his sophisticated understanding of criminal psychology. Edmund could present himself as a helpful witness while secretly enjoying his superior knowledge of the crimes being investigated. The trophy collection system he employed served multiple psychological functions. Personal items from victims provided ongoing satisfaction between crimes, served as psychological triggers for fantasy development, and created tangible connections to his acts of ultimate power. His victim approach techniques became increasingly refined through practice and analysis. Edmund studied the psychology of hitchhiking culture, understanding how young women made trust decisions and what presentation would most effectively overcome their natural caution. The killing location selection process reveals his understanding of crime scene psychology. Edmund chose sites that provided privacy for extended victim interaction while offering multiple escape routes and minimal forensic evidence contamination. His psychological preparation rituals before each crime demonstrate the methodical nature of his approach. Edmund didn't kill impulsively, he prepared mentally, emotionally, and practically for each hunting expedition, treating murder as a complex operation requiring careful planning. The victim control methodology he developed was designed to maintain psychological dominance throughout the entire criminal process. From initial contact through final disposal, Edmund maintained absolute control over every aspect of victim experience. His adaptation capabilities allowed him to modify his methodology based on changing circumstances. When hitchhiking became less common, Edmund adjusted his victim acquisition techniques. When police investigations intensified, he refined his concealment methods. The psychological analysis he conducted of each crime provided data for methodological improvement. Edmund studied victim reactions, law enforcement responses, and investigative techniques to continuously refine his criminal system. His understanding of criminal profiling allowed him to deliberately confuse investigators by varying aspects of his methodology. Edmund knew that consistency in method would eventually lead to his identification, so he planned strategic variations. The equipment procurement and maintenance system he developed ensured reliable access to necessary tools. Edmund acquired weapons legally, maintained vehicles properly, and secured disposal equipment through legitimate channels, avoiding suspicious purchases. His timing methodology for body disposal was designed to maximize decomposition while minimizing discovery risk. Edmund understood that delayed discovery would compromise forensic evidence and complicate victim identification. The psychological rewards system he created sustained his motivation for continued killing. Each successful crime provided multiple forms of satisfaction: power expression, sexual gratification, intellectual achievement, and superiority confirmation. His risk assessment capabilities allowed him to operate for extended periods without detection. Edmund continuously evaluated threat levels, adjusted his methodology based on investigative pressure, and maintained operations only when conditions favored success. The documentation avoidance system he employed prevented the creation of incriminating evidence. Edmund maintained his detailed mental records without creating written materials that could compromise his operations if discovered. His victim interaction methodology was designed to extract maximum psychological satisfaction from each encounter. Edmund prolonged victim terror and helplessness to enhance his experience of absolute power and control. The mobility component of his methodology allowed him to expand his hunting territory while confusing jurisdictional investigations. Edmund operated across multiple law enforcement territories, complicating investigative coordination and evidence sharing. His psychological maintenance system sustained his ability to continue killing while maintaining his public persona. Edmund developed techniques for managing post-crime emotional states, preventing psychological breakdown, and maintaining operational effectiveness. The methodology Edmund Kemper developed represents the pinnacle of criminal sophistication. His systematic approach to every aspect of serial killing created a criminal system that was nearly perfect in its execution and concealment, making him one of the most successful and dangerous predators in criminal history. Perhaps no aspect of Edmund Kemper's criminal psychology reveals his sophisticated intelligence more clearly than his victim selection process. This wasn't the random opportunistic predation of most serial killers, but rather a carefully designed system that combined psychological profiling, risk assessment, and strategic planning to identify targets who would provide maximum satisfaction while presenting minimal detection risk. Edmund's victim profile development began during his years of psychological preparation, when he spent countless hours observing potential targets and analyzing their behavioral patterns. He understood that successful serial killing required victims who were accessible, controllable, and whose disappearances would not immediately trigger intensive investigations. The demographic targeting Edmund employed reveals his sophisticated understanding of victim psychology and law enforcement priorities. Young women, particularly college students, represented the optimal intersection of his psychological needs and operational requirements. They were trusting, mobile, and often estranged from family support networks. His geographical victim selection strategy demonstrates criminal psychology operating at a strategic level. Edmund chose targets from areas where he could establish legitimacy and familiarity while maintaining operational security. The University of California, Santa Cruz campus became his primary hunting ground for precisely calculated reasons. The physical characteristics Edmund sought in his victims weren't simply based on sexual attraction, but rather on complex psychological factors related to his relationship with his mother and his need for power expression. He targeted women who represented both his ideal feminine form and symbolic maternal figures. Edmund's understanding of hitchhiking culture in 1970s California provided him with unprecedented access to potential victims. He studied the psychology of young women who hitchhiked, understanding their decision-making processes, their trust assessment methods, and their vulnerability patterns. The temporal patterns of his victim selection reveal sophisticated operational planning. Edmund understood that certain times of day, days of the week, and seasonal periods provided optimal conditions for victim acquisition while minimizing witness presence and police patrol encounters. His psychological profiling of individual targets went far beyond simple appearance assessment. Edmund studied behavioral indicators that suggested vulnerability, body language, decision-making patterns, social isolation markers, and emotional states that would make victims more susceptible to his manipulation. The risk assessment methodology Edmund applied to victim selection demonstrates his understanding of criminal investigation procedures. He avoided targets whose disappearances would trigger immediate, intensive searches, women with strong family connections, scheduled appointments, or high-profile social positions. His adaptation capabilities and victim selection allowed him to modify his targeting criteria based on changing circumstances. When certain victim types became less available or more risky, Edmund adjusted his profile to maintain operational effectiveness while preserving his psychological satisfaction. The psychological significance of victim age in Edmund's selection process reveals deep connections to his maternal relationship and power fantasies. He specifically targeted women in their late teens and early 20s ages that represented both sexual attractiveness and symbolic revenge against feminine authority. Edmund's understanding of victim transportation patterns provided him with strategic advantages in target acquisition. He studied how young women traveled, where they waited for rides, and what circumstances made them most vulnerable to his approach techniques. The social isolation factors Edmund sought in his victims demonstrate his sophisticated understanding of investigation patterns. He preferentially targeted women who were traveling alone, separated from their normal social networks, or experiencing temporary disconnection from family and friends. His victim approach methodology was calibrated to exploit specific psychological vulnerabilities. Edmund understood how young women assess threat levels and designed his presentation to trigger trust responses rather than caution or fear reactions. The economic factors Edmund considered in victim selection reveal his understanding of class dynamics and investigative resource allocation. He often targeted women from middle-class backgrounds whose disappearances would generate police attention without triggering overwhelming investigative responses. Edmund's psychological analysis of victim personality types allowed him to predict behavioral responses during the abduction and killing process. He could identify women who would be more compliant, more resistant, or more likely to attempt escape, tailoring his approach accordingly. The seasonal patterns in his victim selection demonstrate Edmund's understanding of environmental factors that affected both victim availability and operational security. He adjusted his hunting patterns based on weather conditions, university schedules, and seasonal travel behaviors. His consideration of victim vehicle access reveals the practical aspects of his selection methodology. Edmund preferred targets who were genuinely dependent on hitchhiking rather than those with alternative transportation options, ensuring greater control over the encounter dynamics. The psychological triggers Edmund sought in potential victims were related to his complex emotional needs. He was drawn to women who exhibited characteristics that reminded him of his mother while also representing his idealized feminine figures, creating internal conflict that enhanced his psychological satisfaction. Edmund's understanding of victim family dynamics influenced his targeting decisions. He studied how quickly families would report disappearances, how aggressively they would pursue investigations, and what resources they could mobilize to pressure law enforcement. The educational background factors he considered in victim selection weren't simply about intelligence levels, but rather about lifestyle predictability and social network characteristics. College students provided optimal combinations of accessibility and limited family oversight. His analysis of victim travel patterns allowed him to predict where and when potential targets would be most vulnerable. Edmund studied campus schedules, social events, and transportation needs to position himself optimally for victim encounters. The psychological manipulation Edmund employed during initial victim contact was specifically designed based on his selection criteria. He tailored his approach to exploit the exact vulnerabilities he had identified during his target assessment process. Edmund's consideration of victim physical capabilities influenced his selection methodology. He understood that his size advantage was crucial for maintaining control, but he also sought victims whose physical characteristics would enhance rather than complicate his operational objectives. The timing coordination between victim selection and operational readiness demonstrates Edmund's sophisticated criminal planning. He didn't simply encounter potential victims and act impulsively, he coordinated target identification with his psychological and practical preparation for killing. His understanding of victims' social media and communication patterns, though limited by 1970 seconds technology, still influenced his selection process. Edmund considered how quickly victim disappearances would be discovered and reported based on their social connectivity patterns. The psychological compatibility factors Edmund saw in his victims reveal the complex emotional dynamics driving his crimes. He needed victims who would provide adequate psychological satisfaction through their terror, helplessness, and ultimate submission to his absolute control. Edmund's victim selection methodology evolved continuously based on operational experience and changing circumstances. He refined his criteria, adjusted his targeting strategies, and improved his identification techniques throughout his killing career. The geographical distribution of his victim selection was designed to confuse investigative efforts while maintaining his operational security. Edmund chose targets from different areas and jurisdictions to prevent pattern recognition while staying within his territorial comfort zone. His understanding of victim lifestyle factors allowed him to predict behavioral patterns that would affect his operational success. Edmund could anticipate victim reactions, escape attempt likelihood, and compliance levels based on his sophisticated psychological profiling. The ultimate sophistication of Edmund's victim selection process lay in its integration with every other aspect of his criminal methodology. His targeting wasn't isolated decision-making, but rather a coordinated component of a comprehensive criminal system designed to maximize success while minimizing detection risk. The victims Edmund Kemper selected weren't random casualties of criminal opportunity, but rather carefully chosen targets whose characteristics, circumstances, and vulnerabilities aligned perfectly with his psychological needs and operational requirements, making him one of history's most strategically sophisticated serial killers. The environmental psychology surrounding Edmund Kemper's crimes reveals how perfectly aligned circumstances created the ideal conditions for sustained serial killing. Santa Cruz County in the early 1970s represented a convergence of social, geographical, and cultural factors that transformed what might have been isolated incidents into a systematic hunting operation spanning nearly 2 years. The counterculture movement of the late 1960s and early 1970s had fundamentally altered social dynamics in California, creating unprecedented opportunities for predators like Edmund. The hitchhiking culture that emerged from this period provided him with a constant stream of potential victims who had been culturally conditioned to trust strangers offering assistance. Edmund's selection of Santa Cruz as his primary hunting ground wasn't coincidental, but rather the result of careful environmental analysis. The area offered the perfect combination of university population, rural isolation, and geographical features that facilitated both victim acquisition and body disposal while complicating law enforcement investigations. The University of California, Santa Cruz campus created a unique demographic concentration that served Edmund's victim selection criteria perfectly. Thousands of young women lived in relative independence from family oversight while maintaining the trusting, idealistic worldview that made them vulnerable to his psychological manipulation techniques. The geographical features of Santa Cruz County provided Edmund with tactical advantages that he exploited with military precision. The combination of coastal highways, mountainous terrain, and dense forests offered multiple approach routes, killing locations, and disposal sites, while creating jurisdictional complications for investigators. Edmund's intimate knowledge of local weather patterns influenced his operational timing and methodology. He understood how fog, rain, and seasonal changes affected visibility, police patrol patterns, and body decomposition rates, using this environmental intelligence to optimize his criminal activities. The transportation infrastructure of the region played a crucial role in Edmund's success. Highway 1 and Highway 17 provided him with high-traffic corridors where hitchhikers congregated, while also offering quick access to remote areas where he could kill and dispose of victims without detection. The social environment of Santa Cruz in the early 1970s was characterized by a general atmosphere of trust and openness that Edmund ruthlessly exploited. The community's belief in human goodness and rejection of traditional caution created conditions where his manipulation techniques were extraordinarily effective. Edmund's understanding of local law enforcement capabilities and limitations allowed him to operate with remarkable freedom. He studied police patrol schedules, jurisdictional boundaries, and investigative resources to ensure his activities remained below the threshold of intensive investigation. The economic factors affecting the region created additional environmental advantages for Edmund's operations. The combination of expensive housing and limited student resources meant that hitchhiking wasn't just a cultural choice, but often an economic necessity, ensuring a steady supply of potential victims. The seasonal patterns of university life provided Edmund with predictable victim availability cycles. He understood when students would be traveling, when campus populations would be reduced, and when family connections would be temporarily weakened, timing his hunting activities to exploit these vulnerabilities. Edmund's exploitation of the area's recreational patterns reveals his sophisticated environmental awareness. He understood how people used the region's beaches, parks, and hiking areas, positioning himself to encounter potential victims in contexts where his presence seemed natural and non-threatening. The media environment of the early 1970s worked to Edmund's advantage by limiting information sharing between law enforcement agencies and communities. Without modern communication systems, his crimes could remain isolated incidents rather than being recognized as part of a coordinated pattern. Edmund's use of the region's remote locations for body disposal demonstrates his intimate knowledge of local geography and ecology. He understood decomposition rates in different environments, access limitations to various areas, and the likelihood of discovery in different seasonal conditions. The cultural environment surrounding mental health treatment in the early 1970s provided Edmund with additional cover for his activities. His status as a successfully rehabilitated former patient gave him social credibility, while the stigma surrounding mental health issues prevented deeper scrutiny of his behavior. Edmund's understanding of local traffic patterns allowed him to optimize his hunting activities while minimizing exposure to potential witnesses. He studied when and where hitchhikers were most likely to be present, while police and civilian traffic was minimal. The political environment of the period, with its emphasis on civil liberties and rehabilitation, created a climate where Edmund's requests for privacy and independence were respected rather than viewed with suspicion. His rights as a former patient were protected even when his behavior might have warranted investigation. Edmund's exploitation of the region's multiple law enforcement jurisdictions demonstrates his understanding of bureaucratic limitations. He could commit crimes that cross city, county, and state boundaries, complicating investigations and preventing the coordination necessary to recognize his pattern. The technological limitations of the early 1970s provided Edmund with significant operational advantages. Without modern forensic techniques, communication systems, or surveillance capabilities. Law enforcement agencies were severely limited in their ability to connect his crimes or gather evidence. Edmund's use of the area's social networks reveals his sophisticated understanding of community psychology. He cultivated relationships within law enforcement and academic communities that provided him with intelligence about investigations while establishing his credibility as a reformed and productive citizen. The environmental factors surrounding victim disposal sites were carefully analyzed and exploited by Edmund. He understood soil conditions, water flow patterns, wildlife activity, and human access patterns that would affect both decomposition and discovery likelihood. Edmund's timing of his crimes relative to environmental conditions shows his sophisticated operational planning. He understood how weather events, seasonal changes, and natural cycles would affect his ability to commit crimes and dispose of evidence without detection. The social environment of the counterculture movement provided Edmund with additional psychological cover. His size and appearance, which might have seemed threatening in other contexts, were viewed more neutrally in a community that valued nonconformity and rejected traditional appearance-based judgments. Edmund's understanding of the region's emergency response capabilities influenced his operational methodology. He knew response times for different areas, the availability of medical assistance, and the likelihood of intervention, allowing him to calculate acceptable risk levels for his activities. The educational environment at UC Santa Cruz created specific vulnerabilities that Edmund exploited systematically. The campus culture emphasized trust, openness, and social experimentation, creating conditions where traditional safety precautions were often abandoned. Edmund's analysis of local media coverage patterns allowed him to gauge investigative pressure and public attention. He understood how his crimes were being reported, what information was being shared, and how to modify his activities to maintain his operational security. The economic pressures affecting local law enforcement agencies in the early 1970s limited their investigative capabilities. Budget constraints, staffing limitations, and equipment shortages created gaps in coverage that Edmund identified and exploited. Edmund's understanding of the region's demographic patterns allowed him to predict victim availability and behavior. He knew when student populations would be largest, when families would be visiting, and when temporary isolation of potential victims would be maximized. The cultural shift toward greater personal freedom and independence, particularly for young women, created unprecedented opportunities for predators. Traditional family and community oversight systems had weakened without being replaced by adequate safety awareness or support systems. Edmund's exploitation of environmental factors wasn't opportunistic, but rather strategic and systematic. He conducted what amounted to environmental intelligence gathering, studying every aspect of his operational territory to optimize his criminal activities while minimizing detection risk. The convergence of social change, geographical advantages, technological limitations, and cultural factors created what can only be described as perfect environmental conditions for sustained serial killing. Edmund Kemper didn't simply benefit from fortunate circumstances, he analyzed and exploited every environmental factor with the precision of a military strategist planning a campaign. Understanding Edmund Kemper's escalation patterns requires examining not just the increasing frequency and brutality of his crimes, but the sophisticated psychological evolution that drove him to constantly seek greater expressions of power, control, and psychological satisfaction. Unlike most serial killers, whose escalation follows predictable patterns of impulsive violence, Edmund's progression was calculated, analytical, and terrifyingly methodical. The psychological foundation for Edmund's escalation was established during his first successful murders of Mary Ann Pess and Anita Lucasa. The extraordinary satisfaction he derived from these crimes created an immediate psychological addiction that demanded increasingly intense experiences to achieve the same level of gratification. Edmund's escalation timeline reveals a pattern of accelerating frequency that correlates directly with his growing confidence and operational sophistication. The 4-month gap between his first murders and his next victim gave way to increasingly shorter intervals as his psychological need for killing intensified and his fear of detection diminished. The victim count escalation from pairs to individuals reflects Edmund's growing confidence in his ability to control situations single-handedly. His early preference for multiple victims provided backup psychological satisfaction and reduced the risk of victim escape, but experience taught him that single victims offered greater operational control. Edmund's geographical escalation demonstrates his expanding territorial confidence and his need for fresh hunting grounds. As he exhausted optimal victim sources in familiar areas, he broadened his operational territory while maintaining the environmental advantages that had made his early crimes successful. The weapon escalation in Edmund's crimes reveals his evolving understanding of killing efficiency and psychological impact. While he maintained his preference for firearms as control tools, he increasingly employed knives and other instruments for the actual killing, seeking more intimate and personally satisfying methods of ending life. Edmund's escalation in post-mortem activities represents perhaps the most disturbing aspect of his psychological evolution. His necrophilic behavior became more elaborate and extended, while his dismemberment techniques grew increasingly sophisticated and methodical as he sought greater psychological satisfaction from victim control. The trophy collection escalation shows Edmund's growing need for tangible connections to his crimes. Personal items, photographs, and body parts served as psychological triggers for fantasy reliving, but their importance in his psychological maintenance system grew exponentially with each successful crime. Edmund's interaction escalation with law enforcement reveals his increasing confidence and psychological sophistication. Early in his career, he avoided police contact, but as his confidence grew, he began actively engaging with investigators, deriving satisfaction from his ability to fool those hunting him. The risk-taking escalation in Edmund's behavior demonstrates the classic serial killer pattern of growing overconfidence leading to increasingly dangerous operational choices. His early extreme caution gave way to bolder victim acquisition methods, longer victim interaction periods, and more elaborate crime scenes. Edmund's escalation in victim interaction duration reflects his growing psychological need for extended power expression. Early victims were killed relatively quickly, but later victims endured longer periods of terror as Edmund learned to extract maximum psychological satisfaction from their helplessness. The brutality escalation in Edmund's crimes wasn't simply increasing violence, but rather increasingly personal and intimate forms of violence. He moved from efficient killing to elaborate torture scenarios that provided greater psychological satisfaction through extended victim suffering. Edmund's escalation in crime scene elaboration demonstrates his growing confidence and his increasing need for psychological expression through his criminal acts. Early crime scenes were functional and efficient, while later scenes became elaborate expressions of his psychological pathology. The temporal escalation patterns in Edmund's crimes reveal his increasing psychological dependence on killing for emotional regulation. The intervals between crimes shortened as his ability to achieve satisfaction through fantasy and memory diminished, requiring more frequent reality-based experiences. Edmund's escalation in victim disposal methods reflects both his growing sophistication and his increasing psychological detachment from human life. Body disposal evolved from pragmatic concealment to elaborate systems that served his ongoing psychological needs through continued victim control. The psychological escalation in Edmund's relationship with his own violence represents the most significant aspect of his development. He evolved from someone who killed to satisfy specific psychological needs to someone whose entire identity became centered around his role as an apex predator. Edmund's escalation in manipulation sophistication allowed him to maintain his double life while engaging in increasingly frequent and elaborate crimes. His ability to present himself as normal and even helpful to the community grew more sophisticated as his criminal activities intensified. The planning escalation in Edmund's crimes demonstrates his evolution from opportunistic predator to systematic hunter. Early crimes involved basic planning, while later crimes required elaborate logistical coordination and sophisticated risk management. Edmund's escalation in forensic awareness shows his growing understanding of investigative techniques and his corresponding development of countermeasures. He became increasingly sophisticated in evidence elimination and crime scene management as his criminal career progressed. The fantasy escalation that drove Edmund's criminal development involved increasingly elaborate and specific scenarios that required reality-based implementation. His mental rehearsals became so detailed and demanding that only actual crimes could provide adequate psychological satisfaction. Edmund's escalation in victim targeting sophistication reflects his growing understanding of human psychology and his increasing ability to identify and exploit specific vulnerabilities. His victim selection became more precise and psychologically sophisticated over time. The confidence escalation that characterized Edmund's criminal career eventually became his primary vulnerability. His growing belief in his own superiority and invincibility led to the operational mistakes that would ultimately result in his capture. Edmund's escalation in psychological experimentation with victims reveals his growing need for novel experiences and greater understanding of human psychology under extreme stress. Each crime became a laboratory for exploring different aspects of fear, pain, and death. The territorial escalation in Edmund's operations reflects both his growing confidence and his increasing psychological needs. As familiar hunting grounds became less satisfying or more risky, he expanded his operational area while maintaining his sophisticated methodology. Edmund's escalation in social interaction demonstrates his growing confidence in his ability to fool others and his increasing pleasure in demonstrating his intellectual superiority. He became more socially active even as his crimes intensified. The technological escalation in Edmund's crimes shows his adaptation to changing circumstances and his continuous refinement of his criminal methodology. He incorporated new tools and techniques to maintain operational effectiveness as law enforcement capabilities evolved. Edmund's escalation in psychological analysis of his own crimes represents his evolution into a student of his own pathology. He became increasingly sophisticated in understanding his own motivations and psychological processes, using this self-knowledge to refine his criminal techniques. The documentation escalation in Edmund's mental record-keeping reflects his growing need to preserve and organize his criminal experiences. His internal database of victim characteristics, crime details, and investigative responses became increasingly elaborate and detailed. Edmund's escalation in risk calculation demonstrates his evolution from cautious predator to overconfident apex killer. His risk assessment capabilities became more sophisticated even as his willingness to accept higher risk levels increased dramatically. The psychological satisfaction escalation that drove Edmund's continued killing eventually became unsustainable. His need for increasingly intense experiences led to operational choices that compromised his security and ultimately resulted in his capture. Edmund's escalation patterns reveal the fundamental psychology of serial killing, the progressive development of an addiction to power and control that demands increasingly intense expressions to maintain psychological satisfaction. His systematic escalation across multiple dimensions of criminal behavior made him one of history's most dangerous and sophisticated predators, while simultaneously creating the conditions that would lead to his eventual downfall. The psychological dynamics between Edmund Kemper and the law enforcement agencies investigating his crimes represent one of criminal psychology's most fascinating case studies. Edmund's genius-level intelligence, combined with his intimate knowledge of investigative procedures, created a deadly game of intellectual chess where he maintained the upper hand for nearly 2 years while actively participating in the investigation of his own crimes. Edmund's relationship with local law enforcement began long before his killing spree, establishing the foundation for what would become his greatest psychological advantage. His frequent visits to police bars, his expressed interest in law enforcement careers, and his cultivation of friendships with officers created a network of relationships that provided him with unprecedented access to investigative intelligence. The psychological profile that investigators developed of the unknown killer ironically excluded Edmund from suspicion, despite his obvious qualifications. His status as a successfully rehabilitated former mental patient, combined with his helpful demeanor and apparent cooperation with investigations, created a psychological blind spot that protected him from scrutiny. Edmund's active participation in the investigation of his own crimes represents perhaps the most psychologically sophisticated aspect of his criminal career. He didn't simply avoid police attention, he inserted himself into the investigative process, offering theories, suggesting leads, and positioning himself as a valuable civilian asset. The investigative methodology employed by Santa Cruz law enforcement was systematically compromised by Edmund's insider knowledge. His understanding of evidence collection procedures, witness interview techniques, and profile development allowed him to tailor his crimes to confuse and misdirect investigative efforts. Edmund's psychological manipulation of investigators was extraordinarily sophisticated. He understood how law enforcement officers thought, what information they valued, and how to present himself as credible and helpful while secretly gathering intelligence about investigative progress and priorities. The jurisdictional complications that hindered the investigation played directly into Edmund's strategic advantages. His crimes crossed multiple law enforcement boundaries, creating coordination problems that he understood and exploited to prevent the pattern recognition that might have led to his identification. Edmund's analysis of investigative psychology allowed him to predict law enforcement responses and adjust his methodology accordingly. He understood how different types of evidence would be interpreted, what investigative resources would be allocated, and how to influence investigative priorities through crime scene manipulation. The psychological pressure on investigators grew exponentially as Edmund's crimes continued without apparent progress toward his identification. The combination of public scrutiny, political pressure, and professional frustration created an investigative environment that Edmund could observe and exploit. Edmund's understanding of forensic limitations in the early 1970s gave him significant advantages in evidence management and crime scene preparation. He knew what trace evidence investigators could detect, what preservation methods they employed, and how to eliminate or contaminate potential evidence. The investigative tunnel vision that developed as the case progressed worked to Edmund's advantage by focusing attention on theories and suspects that excluded him from consideration. His psychological profiling of the investigators allowed him to reinforce their misconceptions while gathering intelligence about their progress. Edmund's exploitation of investigative communication patterns reveals his sophisticated understanding of law enforcement culture. He knew how information flowed between agencies, what details would be shared publicly, and how to position himself to receive maximum intelligence while providing minimal useful information. The psychological impact of Edmund's crimes on the investigating officers created additional advantages for his continued operations. The emotional toll of working such brutal cases, combined with the frustration of apparent lack of progress, compromised investigative effectiveness while providing Edmund with psychological satisfaction. Edmund's manipulation of witness interviews demonstrates his understanding of memory, psychology, and investigative procedures. He could influence how witnesses recalled events, what details they emphasized, and how their information was interpreted by investigators. The investigative resource allocation decisions made by law enforcement agencies were systematically influenced by Edmund's crime scene manipulation and misdirection techniques. He understood how to make certain aspects of his crimes appear more or less significant, directing investigative attention away from productive leads. Edmund's psychological analysis of individual investigators allowed him to tailor his interactions for maximum effectiveness. He understood their personalities, their investigative strengths and weaknesses, and how to present information in ways that would influence their thinking. The media management aspects of the investigation provided Edmund with additional opportunities for intelligence gathering and misdirection. His understanding of how information flowed from law enforcement to media and back again allowed him to influence public perception and investigative priorities. Edmund's exploitation of investigative psychology extended to his understanding of how criminal profiles were developed and applied. He could analyze the behavioral assumptions underlying investigative theories and modify his activities to confuse profiling efforts. The psychological warfare Edmund conducted against the investigation involved systematic undermining of investigative confidence and effectiveness. His ability to continue killing while maintaining apparent cooperation with law enforcement created doubt about investigative competence and methodology. Edmund's understanding of interrogation psychology prepared him for eventual questioning while allowing him to evaluate investigative techniques. During his civilian interactions with officers, he learned how investigators approached suspects, what questions they asked, and what responses they found convincing. The investigative coordination problems that plagued the case were exacerbated by Edmund's understanding of bureaucratic psychology and jurisdictional politics. He knew how to exploit interagency rivalries and communication failures to maintain his operational security. Edmund's analysis of investigative priorities allowed him to predict resource allocation and adjust his activities to avoid intensive scrutiny. He understood what types of crimes received maximum attention and how to structure his activities to remain below critical investigation thresholds. The psychological pressure Edmund applied to the investigation through his continued success created a cycle of investigative frustration that compromised effectiveness. Each successful crime demonstrated investigative failure, creating doubt and second-guessing that further hindered progress. Edmund's exploitation of investigative assumptions about criminal behavior allowed him to operate outside expected patterns while maintaining psychological consistency. His understanding of criminal psychology theory enabled him to confuse behavioral analysis while satisfying his own psychological needs. The investigative blind spots that protected Edmund from suspicion were systematically reinforced by his sophisticated understanding of law enforcement psychology. He knew what behaviors would be interpreted as suspicious and what presentations would be accepted as normal and helpful. Edmund's psychological preparation for eventual capture involved extensive analysis of interrogation techniques and legal procedures. His study of investigative psychology prepared him for the questioning process, while his understanding of criminal justice procedures informed his eventual confession strategy. The investigation of Edmund Kemper's crimes was compromised not by investigative incompetence, but by the unprecedented sophistication of his psychological manipulation and strategic misdirection. His understanding of investigative psychology, combined with his insider access and genius-level intelligence, created advantages that even the most skilled investigators could not overcome. Edmund's relationship with the investigation represents the ultimate expression of his need for intellectual superiority and psychological control. He didn't simply evade capture, he actively participated in and influenced the investigation while deriving satisfaction from his ability to fool those whose job it was to catch him. The psychological chess game between Edmund and law enforcement investigators reveals the fundamental vulnerability of investigative systems when confronted by suspects who understand their methodology and psychology. Edmund's case demonstrates how criminal intelligence can be weaponized to exploit the very systems designed to ensure public safety. The investigation psychology surrounding Edmund Kemper's crimes provides crucial insights into the limitations of traditional investigative approaches when confronted by sophisticated criminal intelligence, while demonstrating the importance of understanding the psychological dynamics that can compromise even the most dedicated investigative efforts. April 24, 1973, represents one of the most psychologically complex moments in criminal history, the day Edmund Kemper voluntarily surrendered himself to authorities, bringing an end to his killing spree not through investigative breakthrough, but through his own calculated decision to stop. This self-directed conclusion reveals profound insights into the psychology of criminal behavior and the internal mechanisms that can override even the most powerful compulsions toward violence. The psychological build-up to Edmund's surrender began months before his final crimes, as the escalating pressure of maintaining his double life while satisfying his increasing need for violence created an unsustainable psychological state. His growing overconfidence had led to operational choices that increased his risk, while his psychological satisfaction from killing had begun to diminish. Edmund's final victim selection of his mother, Clarnell Kemper, represents the psychological completion of a circle that began with his earliest childhood trauma. The woman who had systematically destroyed his psychological development through abuse and manipulation became the ultimate expression of his need for power and control. The murder of his mother on April 20, 1973, was not an impulsive act, but rather the culmination of years of psychological preparation and fantasy development. Edmund had been planning this particular murder since adolescence, understanding that killing the source of his psychological damage would represent either ultimate satisfaction or psychological completion. Edmund's decision to also kill his mother's friend, Sally Hallett, demonstrates his operational methodology even in this highly personal crime. Unable to tolerate a witness to his mother's murder, He eliminated the complication while maintaining control over the crime scene and his own emotional state. The psychological state Edmund experienced after completing these murders was fundamentally different from his previous post-crime periods. Rather than the satisfaction and energetic high he typically felt, he experienced a profound emptiness that suggested his primary psychological motivation had been resolved. Edmund's 3-day period between the murders and his surrender reveals his sophisticated analysis of his own psychological condition and his strategic thinking about his future options. He understood that he had reached a psychological endpoint where continued killing would not provide adequate satisfaction. His decision to drive to Colorado before surrendering demonstrates his continued analytical thinking even in crisis. Edmund wasn't simply fleeing, he was creating distance from the crime scene while giving himself time to analyze his options and prepare for the inevitable confrontation with law enforcement. The psychological calculation behind Edmund's surrender involves complex factors, including his understanding of his own mental state, his analysis of investigative pressure, and his desire to control the narrative of his capture. He chose surrender over capture to maintain psychological dominance even in defeat. Edmund's multiple phone calls to Santa Cruz police before they took him seriously reveal both his frustration with their disbelief and his psychological need for his confession to be properly received and understood. His intellectual pride demanded that his crimes be recognized for their sophistication. The initial police disbelief that Edmund could be the co-ed killer demonstrates how effectively he had maintained his psychological camouflage throughout his criminal career. His helpful, cooperative persona was so convincing that even his detailed confession was initially questioned. Edmund's confession strategy reveals his sophisticated understanding of legal psychology and his desire to maintain control over the revelation of his crimes. He didn't simply admit guilt, he provided a carefully structured narrative that demonstrated his intellectual superiority and psychological insight. The psychological dynamics of Edmund's interrogation were unprecedented in criminal investigation. Rather than a typical suspect trying to minimize culpability, investigators faced a defendant who was eager to discuss his crimes in clinical detail while demonstrating his understanding of criminal psychology. Edmund's detailed recounting of his methodology during questioning served multiple psychological purposes. It satisfied his intellectual pride, demonstrated his superiority over investigators, and provided him with one final opportunity to relive his crimes through narrative description. The investigator's psychological response to Edmund's confession reveals the profound impact of confronting such sophisticated criminal intelligence. They found themselves dealing not with a typical suspect, but with someone who understood criminal psychology better than many professionals in the field. Edmund's cooperation with investigators after his confession wasn't simply helpful behavior, but rather another expression of his need for intellectual dominance. He could demonstrate his superior knowledge while positioning himself as an expert consultant on his own crimes. The psychological profile that emerged from Edmund's confession validated many investigative theories while revealing the limitations of traditional criminal profiling when applied to such sophisticated offenders. His case demonstrated gaps in understanding of highly intelligent criminal psychology. Edmund's insistence on the death penalty during his legal proceedings represents his continued need for control over his own narrative and outcome. Facing the prospect of life imprisonment, he sought to maintain agency by demanding the ultimate punishment for his crimes. The psychological evaluation process conducted after Edmund's arrest revealed the complex interaction between his genius-level intelligence and his profound antisocial pathology. Mental health professionals struggled to assess someone who understood their evaluation methods better than they did. Edmund's media interactions following his capture demonstrate his continued need for intellectual recognition and his pleasure in shocking people with his analytical approach to extreme violence. He could discuss his crimes with clinical detachment while maintaining psychological dominance over his interviewers. The legal psychology surrounding Edmund's case was complicated by his obvious intelligence and his apparent insight into his own pathology. Traditional legal frameworks struggled to address a defendant who was clearly mentally ill, yet demonstrably capable of sophisticated planning and rational decision-making. Edmund's institutional behavior following his conviction reveals his adaptation to a new environment where his physical dominance and criminal reputation provided him with status and influence. Prison became another setting where he could exercise psychological control over others. The psychological impact of Edmund's case on law enforcement procedures led to significant changes in investigative methodology and criminal profiling techniques. His sophisticated manipulation of the investigative process revealed vulnerabilities that required systematic addressing. Edmund's ongoing cooperation with criminal psychology researchers demonstrates his continued need for intellectual engagement and his pleasure in being recognized as an expert on his own pathology. He transformed his criminal expertise into a form of academic consultation. The psychological analysis of Edmund's surrender reveals the complex internal mechanisms that can override even the most powerful criminal compulsions. His case demonstrates that even the most sophisticated serial killers remain subject to psychological pressures that can lead to voluntary cessation of criminal activity. Edmund's post-capture interviews and correspondence reveal his continued intellectual engagement with criminal psychology and his ongoing analysis of his own motivations and methods. He remains one of the most psychologically articulate criminals in history. The psychological legacy of Edmund's capture extends beyond his individual case to influence understanding of criminal intelligence, investigative psychology, and the complex factors that can lead to criminal cessation. His voluntary surrender remains one of the most unusual conclusions to a serial killing career. Edmund's capture represents not the triumph of investigative technique, but rather the psychological completion of his own internal journey from abused child to apex predator to self-analyzing criminal expert. His case demonstrates that the most sophisticated criminal minds remain subject to psychological forces that can ultimately override their compulsions toward violence. The exposure of Edmund Kemper's crimes revealed not just the actions of an individual killer, but the sophisticated psychological systems that can develop when genius-level intelligence is weaponized by profound psychological damage, providing crucial insights into criminal psychology that continue to influence understanding of serial killing behavior decades after his capture. The psychological legacy of Edmund Kemper extends far beyond his individual crimes to fundamentally reshape our understanding of criminal intelligence, the development of antisocial behavior, and the complex relationship between genius and evil. His case represents a watershed moment in criminal psychology that continues to influence law enforcement, mental health treatment, and our broader understanding of human nature's darkest possibilities. Edmund's contribution to criminal psychology research has been unprecedented among serial killers. His willingness to engage with researchers, his articulate self-analysis, and his sophisticated understanding of his own pathology have provided insights into criminal psychology that would have been impossible to obtain through traditional research methods or case studies. The investigative lessons learned from Edmund's case led to fundamental changes in law enforcement methodology. His ability to manipulate investigations while participating in them revealed critical vulnerabilities in traditional investigative approaches that required systematic addressing to prevent future exploitation by sophisticated criminals. Edmund's case demonstrates the profound limitations of traditional rehabilitation models when applied to individuals with genius-level intelligence and sophisticated antisocial pathology. His apparent successful treatment at Atascadero State Hospital masked the fact that his fundamental psychological structure remained unchanged and potentially became more dangerous through institutional learning. The psychological profiling techniques that evolved partly in response to Edmund's case reflect the need for more sophisticated understanding of criminal intelligence and the ways that exceptional intellectual capability can be weaponized for antisocial purposes. His crimes revealed gaps in traditional profiling that required fundamental methodological advancement. Edmund's relationship with his own violence provides crucial insights into the psychology of self-awareness among criminals. Unlike most offenders who minimize or deny their pathology, Edmund's clinical understanding of his own psychological processes offers unprecedented glimpses into the internal experience of extreme antisocial behavior. The environmental factors that enabled Edmund's crimes have influenced understanding of how social conditions, institutional policies, and cultural dynamics can create opportunities for sophisticated predators. His case demonstrates the importance of systemic approaches to crime prevention that address environmental vulnerabilities. Edmund's victim selection and methodology have provided law enforcement with detailed understanding of how intelligent predators identify and exploit vulnerabilities in potential targets. His systematic approach to victim acquisition has influenced safety education and prevention strategies for vulnerable populations. The psychological development patterns visible in Edmund's case have enhanced understanding of how childhood trauma, particularly maternal abuse, can interact with exceptional intelligence to create extremely dangerous individuals. His case provides crucial insights into the developmental psychology of criminal behavior. Edmund's manipulation of mental health and legal systems demonstrates the vulnerabilities these institutions face when confronted by individuals who understand their methodology and can exploit their assumptions. His case has influenced reforms in both mental health treatment and legal procedures. The technological and forensic limitations that Edmund exploited have driven advances in investigative capabilities and evidence analysis techniques. His sophisticated evidence elimination and crime scene management have influenced the development of more advanced forensic methodologies. Edmund's case illustrates the complex relationship between intelligence and moral development, challenging assumptions about the correlation between cognitive ability and ethical behavior. His genius-level intellect combined with complete absence of empathy provides crucial insights into the independence of these psychological domains. The communication skills Edmund developed have provided unprecedented insight into how sophisticated criminals think about their own behavior and justify their actions to themselves and others. His articulate self-analysis offers windows into criminal psychology that are typically impossible to access. Edmund's institutional behavior following his conviction demonstrates how criminal intelligence adapts to controlled environments and continues to seek expression of power and dominance within structural limitations. His prison psychological development provides insights into long-term management of dangerous individuals. The psychological impact of Edmund's crimes on victims' families, law enforcement personnel, and the broader community has influenced understanding of the far-reaching consequences of serial violence. His case demonstrates how sophisticated criminal behavior creates trauma that extends far beyond immediate victims. Edmund's ongoing cooperation with researchers decades after his crimes reflects the complex motivations that can drive continued engagement with criminal behavior analysis. His willingness to discuss his crimes provides ongoing opportunities for psychological insight and understanding. The media psychology surrounding Edmund's case has influenced understanding of how criminal intelligence can be exploited for entertainment while potentially providing dangerous individuals with recognition and validation. His articulate interviews raise ethical questions about criminal celebrity and public fascination with violence. Edmund's case demonstrates the importance of early intervention in cases of childhood trauma and behavioral disturbance. His developmental history provides clear warning signs that, if properly recognized and addressed, might have prevented his evolution into a serial killer. The legal precedents established by Edmund's case have influenced how the justice system handles defendants with exceptional intelligence and sophisticated understanding of their own mental health issues. His case challenged traditional frameworks for assessing criminal responsibility and mental competency. Edmund's contribution to understanding the psychology of confession and surrender has influenced negotiation strategies and investigative approaches when dealing with sophisticated criminals. His voluntary surrender provides insights into the internal pressures that can lead to criminal cessation. The psychological research opportunities provided by Edmund's case continue to yield insights into criminal behavior, antisocial development, and the management of dangerous individuals. His willingness to participate in studies has advanced scientific understanding in multiple domains. Edmund's case highlights the crucial importance of comprehensive background investigations for individuals seeking positions of trust or authority. His ability to present himself as reformed and helpful while maintaining his criminal pathology demonstrates the need for more sophisticated assessment techniques. The prevention strategies that have evolved partly in response to Edmund's case emphasize the importance of environmental awareness, systematic safety protocols, and recognition of sophisticated manipulation techniques. His methodology has influenced safety education across multiple domains. Edmund's psychological legacy extends to broader questions about human nature, the development of evil, and the potential for intelligence to be divorced from morality. His case challenges comfortable assumptions about the relationship between cognitive ability and ethical behavior. The therapeutic implications of Edmund's case have influenced treatment approaches for individuals with antisocial pathology, particularly those with exceptional intelligence. His case demonstrates the limitations of traditional therapeutic interventions when applied to sophisticated antisocial personalities. Edmund's case continues to provide insights into the psychology of criminal cooperation with authorities and the complex motivations that drive continued engagement with the criminal justice system. His ongoing willingness to discuss his crimes offers unique opportunities for understanding criminal psychology. The educational value of Edmund's case extends across multiple disciplines, including psychology, criminology, law enforcement, and social work. His detailed self-analysis and sophisticated understanding of his own behavior provide teaching opportunities that are unmatched in criminal psychology literature. Edmund Kemper's legacy represents both a cautionary tale about the potential for human intelligence to be weaponized for evil purposes and a valuable resource for understanding the complex psychology of criminal behavior. His case continues to influence our understanding of criminal intelligence, investigative psychology, and the fundamental questions about human nature that his crimes so brutally illuminate. The psychological lessons learned from Edmund Kemper's case remind us that intelligence and evil are not mutually exclusive, that sophisticated criminal behavior requires equally sophisticated responses, and that understanding the darkest aspects of human psychology is essential for protecting society from those who would exploit our most fundamental assumptions about human nature and social trust.